All right, so for this assignment, your grade is going to be broken up into techniques. So there are 3 techniques hanging up on the corkboard over there, and 25% of your total area should be covered in a gradient, 25% should have textures, and 25% should be transparent washes. So that leaves 25% for you to do whatever you want with, okay? So here I have some tempera paint and some materials, and I have painted a background and let it dry on one of my shapes. Out of those 3 things, the blending, the textural, and the transparent, which do you think you should do first? Yeah. Yep. The transparent washes make the most sense to do first because in most cases you want to do them on a white piece of paper. You can put a wash over a color, like white is sometimes a beautiful, it can make a beautiful wash on top of something to lighten it, or make it look fuzzy like a cloud. But to do that, you would probably need to let me know that you did that because it's hard for me to see that. So to make a transparent wash with tempera paint, you just add a lot of water, almost treat it like a watercolor. So it's very little pigment and a lot of water. And you can decide how transparent you want it to be, right? You can make it thick, thin, but it shouldn't look like the solid color. So I just added a lot of water, and obviously my shapes are plain compared to what you guys are drawing. You can combine techniques. People often ask me, can I do a texture on my transparent? And my answer is absolutely. But just make sure you still have 25% of your surface covered with both of those. Now with this paint, this is not the same paper you guys are using. You're using a heavier paper, so hopefully it won't wrinkle and buckle as much. Craftsmanship does count. So there. I just did a transparent wash. You can combine colors when you do a wash. You can do a gradient with a wash. There's lots of different options. So that's the first one. A gradient is either one color that changes in itself, like it gets lighter or it gets darker, or it's a color that changes into another color. The key is that it has to be slow. It has to be step by step. You don't want to see any stripes. So one of the best ways to do this is to take your paint and working very quickly, sorry, unless you want your paint to be see-through, you need a dry brush working with this paint. So if you work very quickly and you have wet paint side by side with wet paint, then you can get it to blend in between. This is a technique that's used a lot with acrylics because they stay wet longer. But I can take, it works better with a clean brush. Clean and dry. And I'm just going to zip it down into it. And it may take a couple of passes to really get it to blend. That's one way to make a gradient. You can sort of blend in both directions, figure out what works the best for you. Whoop, there, I just contaminated my white. Sometimes you have to go back and forth. Painting is not an exact science. So that will get it to blend without stripes. You may have to work at it. Whoops, that really didn't do it. There we go. The other way to do it is to start with, some of the pure color, like this. And again, you have to work pretty quickly while it's still wet. And then I'm going to add some white. and sort of grab that color and pull it down. This is a little harder to do it without sort of the stripey effect happening. Grab some more white, pull it down. But if you do it this way and you're somewhat careful, I'll accept it. Grab some more white. I didn't clean my brush. You can clean your brush if you want, but if you're working fast, to try to eliminate the stripe, then it's a little harder to do that and clean your brush. You can experiment with brushing up into it to see if that gets you a cleaner color, and work your way all the way down. The white seems to be, you know, it changes slower than like the black, but it is possible to do gradients with black. All right, so that is a gradient. Gradients work beautifully with transparents as well, because you can use the water to manipulate it a bit more. So that's what that one looks like. And I could go back and fuss with it a little bit, try to get the colors to blend a little bit more. Sometimes just a slightly wet brush will allow you to do that. Even if the paint's a little bit dry, you can come back in and sort of soften that edge a little bit. But you want to be careful you're not just moving the paint around. All right, and then the last one are textures, and this is where it gets really creative and experimental. So I've got this. This is a little wet, but I painted the background. I painted that center shape because I really would encourage you to do your textures on a color and not plain white. If you look up at that one on the wall, you see the triangles that have the sponge colors and stuff. It's really cool because you can see through them. That's the kind of texture we're looking for. We don't so much want to cover the whole thing with splatter. So the best way to achieve that is to use something like a mask. So I used this to actually trace my shape. But what you can do is take a piece of tracing paper. Tracing paper wrinkles a little bit. So if you want a heavier paper, I can give you the drawing paper and you can trace it on the light board. And you put it down, trace your shape out of the middle. And you want to try to get as close as you can when you're doing the drawing. And then you would take a pair of scissors and cut that shape out. And then it will leave you the opening. So even though my paint is wet underneath, I'm still going to go ahead and do this. So I put this on top, and now I have some choices. I can use a sponge. So the sponges work best if you get them a little wet and then wring them out so there isn't a lot of moisture in them, but you want them to be soft. And hopefully the last person to use it cleaned it. So there are sponges over at the sink. And the idea is you're just going to dip part of it into it. You don't want to smush the whole sponge down because you just want like little dabs of the paint. And holding your mask, this is called a mask, in place, you're going to dab it on and you will see the color through it. So that's, one color. I can also add another color to it. And you can be really free with, your color choices. You can use the metallics to add interest. You can mix colors. The more you mix colors, the more interesting your painting's going to be. If you just use straight colors out of the tube for everything, it's going to look pretty generic. So now I'm going to add a little gold to this. And the mask is just keeping it off of the rest of my painting, especially if you cut it carefully. So it adds a really nice surface variation. Right? So it would make sense for you to plan things out. You can also use what's called a dry brush. Now, if you wanted to do this, if you wanted to do your gradients in a specific shape, you could make a mask and, you know, get your gradient to fit a certain shape. Dry brush is taking literally a brush that's dry and that has uneven tips on it and just barely touching the paint with it. And then you brush across very lightly. It gives you a really stripy kind of look. And you can do this with lots of different colors. You can build up the colors. You can go in different directions, make it kind of plaid-like. That's a kind of a neat way of making a texture. Dry brush. You can splatter. So we have paintbrushes. You dip them in the paint, get them pretty well loaded, and make sure you're out of the way when you do this because you could splatter yourself. And you just rub your thumb over it. I didn't get enough paint. Yeah, I have aprons if anybody needs them. I can't tell if this is not working because I don't have enough paint or because the paint is so transparent. Use a little black. You'll get a little messy, but that's what soap and water is for. Try not to get it on me. All right, it's not working at all. I promise you it does work. I'm going to try this direction. There we go. It gives you a really super fine dot. And there's an example up there on the wall that was like built up with layers and layers and layers of the stippling. It kind of looks really hazy. And then last but not least, one of my favorites is taking a piece of paper, crumpling it up so that it's like an irregular edge to it, and then dipping it in a couple of different colors of paint. And then I would start like on a piece of scrap paper off to the side and using that as if it were a sponge. And depending on how maybe softer paper would work better, you can really create something that looks like a marbleized effect by dabbing in all the different colors. And if you really wanted something to look like marble, I could show you how to do the little white lines on top. All right, so there are dry brush, sponging, splattering, and crumpled paper are 4 ways of making texture. You may think of others yourself too, which is fine. Anything you can think of that you want to do that'll make a texture. The only weird thing about tempera paint is if you have ridges when it's wet, they flatten out when they dry. So just trying to build up thick paint may or may not work. Okay? Questions? Awesome.